Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. We're still in 2 Corinthians 12, coming towards the end of this letter. We're still studying the New Testament church, and Paul is writing this second letter or really technically it's his third letter, but it's the second letter that we have. And today we're looking at Paul talking about his vision and his thorn in the flesh. So we'll go through this, read through this, look at some of the notes, and go through and get closer and closer to the end of 2 Corinthians. So Paul starts off 2 Corinthians 12, 1-10 says, "This boasting will do no good, but I must go on. I will reluctantly tell about visions and revelations from the Lord. I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. That experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. I will boast only about my weakness. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool doing so because I would be telling the truth, but I won't do it because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message. I like that. Even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God, so to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." So now I'm glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weakness and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And so that's that ending. The ending of for when I'm weak, that I'm strong is very drastic contrast to the apostles, or this what they call the quotations he used for super apostles, but those who'd been stirring up the church and causing problems in the church. And they bragged about their strength and how awesome they were, and how powerful they were. And Paul is bragging in his weakness about how weak he is and how everything is because of Christ. And so Paul's accusers, leveled that Paul didn't never had this like spiritual type experience, like excuse me, ecstatic, spiritual type experiences, and he was no mystic, they said, right? But a plain person with no impressive gifts. So even though Paul's authority, right, didn't come from visions and revelations from the Lord, he reveals his secret that he did in fact have such an experience. And so this is barely all we know about this experience, is what he mentions here in Second Corinthians. So he doesn't go into a lot of details. Obviously, he says why, but he says he was caught up, or called up to the third heaven. We'll talk about that here in a minute. When he writes this, he actually talks in the third person in the Greek. It's literally, it says, "I know a man in Christ who was caught up." And talking about himself, he uses the third person in the Greek to talk about this. And the third heaven was a Jewish expression for the immediate presence of God, or heaven itself. And he says this was 14 years ago. And so would have put it in around AD 43. And Paul wasn't sure if his experience was a trance, like if it was, like a vision that he saw, or if he was actually in heaven, him physically taken up to heaven. He doesn't know. He says only God knows that. And he says, Paul could have boasted about this experience, but it was no source of confidence in his ministry, right? He wanted his ministry to be seen, right? He never makes the mystical experience a proof of him being, his authority as an apostle. And he wanted his life and his message to be the proof. And we need to make sure that that's the same way with us, right? I know there's some, I believe, I won't go into all the details, but I do believe there are some, versions of Christianity who are like, well, unless you speak in tongues, or do a particular type of gift, then that doesn't, until you do that, you're not proven to be a Christian, or you're not like truly saved and stuff like that. And we need to be careful with stuff like that, because our salvation doesn't come from gifts, right? Our our gift, having a gift doesn't make us saved. And so we need to be very careful with thoughts and trains of thought like that. And the same thing with what Paul talked about. He's like, yeah, I could have bragged about these mystical experiences that I've had and stuff like that, but that's something I'm just saying, right? And so I have no proof of that. I can just tell you what I saw or my experience, but there's no proof in that. He said, but my life and my message, right? I can live that out. My message I can give and I can live it out, and that there's proof in that there's you can see that. And so that's that's what he that's why he's bent on doing that, because again all the spiritual, all this like mystic stuff, these visions that he had, whatever they were, he can't prove these, but he can prove who Christ is by the way he lives. And that's what we need to remember. We can prove that Christ lives, Christ is who he is, because of the way we are, and the fact that we back up our message and with actions and with proof, and we need to make sure that. And so instead, he's going to boast about his weakness. And so he talks about his thorn in the flesh. We don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. We only know that its purpose was to keep him from becoming proud, right? To prick the bubble of pride. And he says it's a messenger of Satan, that is something or someone of evil, that was evil. And so Paul prayed to take it away. Now, here's my thought on this, and this just is studying it some, diving kind of deep into the scriptures. And because of the answer, right, the Lord answered him when he asked him to take it away, that he says, my grace is all you need, right? My power works best in weakness. So all you need is my grace. And so here's what I personally believe after studying. There's some scholars, not that I'm putting myself up there with other scholars, who believe this same thing. I believe that Paul's thorn in the flesh was some sort of temptation, right? Something that he struggled with, and that a messenger of Satan, right, or something or someone evil come along and was basically, because we've seen this in the past, God has allowed messengers of Satan to tempt people and he's used them to either correct people or do things like that. That Paul's thorn in the flesh was some sort of temptation that he struggled with, right? And I feel that from reading this, and this is why I think it's because of the answer that God gives, it was a sin that he struggled with, or some sort of temptation that he struggled with, and that there was a messenger sin or someone from Satan was allowed to basically continue to tempt him with it. Now, whether he fell into that sin or not, we don't know. We know that Paul does talk about the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I shouldn't do, I do. But I don't know. And so God sent this for whatever reason to keep him humble and keep him, from getting very prideful. And the reason I think that is because, Paul asked for, hey, take this away. He said, take it away 3 times. And Jesus' answer to him was, my grace is all you need. And so a lot of scholars, some people think it was a physical element, right? Like a speech impediment or blindness or something like that. But I don't feel like the answer, like a temptation, a sinful thing, a sin that you struggle with, right? Asking for that to be taken away, and that the answer to that makes more sense the answer makes the sense when Christ would say, or God would say, "My grace is all you need," right? Because we're saved through grace, right? And so even if he does mess up, or sin, his grace, God's grace is going to cover that because of who he is. If it was a physical element or something like that, grace isn't needed for a disability or physical ailment, right? And so that's where I lean. Again, we don't know 100% sure. I could easily be wrong. So this is my opinion. That's my thought on it. But just by the answer and the fact that it's a messenger from Satan, something that's evil, or someone that's evil, then that tends for me to lean more towards something like a sin that he struggles with, or a temptation that he struggles with, and that's why God's grace covers that, and that's all he needs. And then the second part of that is, my power works best in weakness, and so Paul says human weakness was an opportunity for the power of Christ to work through him by God's grace. And we see that all throughout scripture, like where Paul or God seems to work through some of the weakest people, and I love that that part about God, because as humans we're all weak, and it's amazing to see what he can do through very weak people. And so Paul accepts this suffering, right? Because Christ's strength shows itself through his weakness. And so he accepts that suffering, whatever it is. And he's like, look, I'm proven to be best through my weakness. And so I'm going to continue on through that. So it's an interesting storyline. And it's kind of where Paul kind of finishes up talking about his weaknesses, the boastfulness and boasting about his weakness, or through how Christ works through his weakness and stuff like that. So again, it's a very vulnerable, like I talked about, this is a very vulnerable letter. Paul, talks about things that are very, I think, vulnerable, and his weaknesses, and that kind of stuff. And so, um, it's a side of Paul we get to see that we probably don't get to see in a lot of his letters. And so I appreciate it, and I like studying this, and diving deeper into it. I hope y'all are learning from it. We're going to continue on. Paul, tomorrow, is going to look at the concern for the Corinthians, and then the next couple of days after that, we see Paul's final advice, and then his final greetings to them. And that's the end of our letters to the Second Corinthians. We'll hit like 2 verses in Acts, I think it is. Then we'll flip into Romans, and start a deep study into Romans, which I think is one of the deeper theological books of the entire New Testament. So we'll continue that. As always, I hope you all are learning from these. I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch these, comment, ask questions, share the videos. I really do appreciate that. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, ask that you do that so you get the messages daily, and can continue along with us and follow along with us. But as always, more than anything, I appreciate everyone who watches, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.